Please hug me.
For a second.
Even if it's just for a second.
I ran barefoot. No plan, no destination, with blood on my lips and my heart hammering against my ribs. When I saw that man leaning against the black car, tall, tattooed, with the kind of face no one would dare provoke, I didn't think. I crossed the street, grabbed his shirt, and said the only thing I could. Hold me. Just 1 second. Please. He didn't hold anyone. Ever. But something in my eyes made his body respond before his mind could. He held me. And over the top of my head, he saw the man standing on the corner, fists clenched, eyes like someone who kills slowly. The man backed off, vanished into the dark. I didn't know who I was holding on to. He didn't know who he'd just saved, and that 1 second changed the course of both our lives in ways neither of us could have imagined. Hi, I'm Lena. A special shout out to those of you watching Book 1 for free here on the My Stories platform, completely ad-free and uninterrupted. Chapter 1. The Dark Street. No shoes, no direction, with the taste of iron filling my mouth and the cold of the asphalt cutting the soles of my feet with every step. The Chicago air in March was the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and stayed, but I barely felt it, because the adrenaline was doing the job of whatever coat I hadn't had time to grab. The only thing I knew was that I couldn't stop, because if I stopped, my legs would give out, and if my legs gave out, he'd catch me. Gregor Istvan, the man I called my father, had heavy hands. That wasn't news. At 6, I learned not to spill the glass. At 10, I learned not to talk back. At 17, I learned to lock my bedroom door and push the dresser against it before going to sleep. I should have left sooner. I knew that. But leaving cost money I didn't have, required a place that didn't exist, and every time I got close to saving enough for a deposit on a rented room, something happened. A bill, a theft of my money that Gregor called a contribution to the household, a week without shifts at the restaurant. Staying was horrible, but staying was the devil I knew. Leaving was the dark, but that night, something had been different. The first punch came without warning, without the usual escalation of his voice that I'd come to recognize as an alarm signal. He hit me in the face with a closed fist, and the impact threw my body against the kitchen table hard enough to send the dinner plates shattering across the floor. I didn't wait for the second. I went through the back door while he was still stumbling over the broken pieces, and the last thing I heard was his voice screaming my name as if the name itself were a threat. Maybe it was. In his mouth, everything became a threat, even words that should have been simple, like daughter or come back here. I went down the fire escape with my hands shaking so badly, I nearly lost my grip on the rusted railing, and when my bare feet hit the asphalt of the alley, I ran without looking back. 3 blocks. 4. The neighborhood I knew by heart looked unrecognizable in the dark, as if the streets had rearranged themselves just to confuse me. I didn't have my phone. It had been on the table when the first punch came. No money, no ID, nothing but the thin pajamas, and the blood running from the corner of my mouth to my chin. I turned onto a wider street, one of the secondary avenues that separated my neighborhood from the rest of the city, and that's where I saw him. A black car parked at the curb, the kind of car that didn't belong in that neighborhood. Too clean, too quiet, too expensive for any corner on that side of Chicago. And leaning against it, arms crossed, with the posture of someone in no hurry to leave, was a man, tall, broad shoulders inside a dark overcoat, dark hair pushed back, a jawline that seemed designed to intimidate, and tattoos climbing up his neck to just below his ear. He was talking on the phone in a low voice, but stopped mid-sentence when he saw me appear at the corner, barefoot, bleeding, breathless, with the eyes of a cornered animal. I didn't think. I crossed the street, closed my fingers around his shirt and said, "Hold me, just 1 second, please." He didn't move. His fingers were still holding the phone near his ear, and I felt the rigidity of his entire body against my hands, as if every muscle had locked at the same time. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't decipher. It wasn't pity. It wasn't disgust. It wasn't irritation. It was something deeper than surprise, as if I'd said something he hadn't heard in a long time. And then, without a word, he lowered the phone and held me. His arms closed around my shoulders with a hesitation that lasted less than a second, as if his body were doing something his mind hadn't yet authorized. He was solid, a wall of muscle and warmth and expensive fabric that swallowed my entire body. I pressed my face against his chest and felt his heartbeat, steady against my cheek, constant and unwavering, so different from mine, it seemed to belong to a different species of person. I trembled with everything I'd been holding in since the first punch, since the table, since the shattered pieces on the floor, and his arms tightened a little more, like an automatic response to something he hadn't planned to feel. His scent enveloped me, something woody and expensive, mixed with the cold of the night, and for 1 second, a single second, I felt safe, not saved, not protected, just safe, as if the world had stopped spinning long enough for me to breathe. He said nothing. He just held me, with the steadiness of someone who didn't know what he was doing, but knew he wasn't going to stop. I don't know how long we stayed like that. It could have been 10 seconds or it could have been a full minute, but at some point, I felt his posture shift, a different kind of tension, sharper, that had nothing to do with me. His chin rose above my head, and the embrace, which until then had been merely firm, became protective in a way that made my stomach go cold. He was looking at someone. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. I knew who was there before I even heard the footsteps on the opposite sidewalk, because my body recognized Gregor's presence the same way it recognized storms, by instinct, by the fear that came before the sound. The footsteps stopped. The man holding me didn't move, didn't speak, didn't look away. I felt the faint vibration of his chest against my face. Not a word, but something that felt like a warning, the kind of sound a large animal makes before deciding whether it's worth attacking. The footsteps retreated, slowly at first, then fast, and then silence. Gregor was gone. I let out the breath I didn't even know I'd been holding and loosened my fingers from his shirt, noticing for the first time that my knuckles were white from gripping so hard. I stepped back, and the cold returned with a brutality that made me cross my arms over my chest. "I'm sorry," I said, unable to look at him. I'm sorry. Who was that man? His voice caught me off guard. Not the tone, but the choice. He didn't ask if I was okay. He asked who the man was, as if he already knew the rest. "My father," I said, and the word scraped my throat on the way out, as if it were a shame to be spoken. He was silent. His eyes studied me with a calm I didn't deserve. "He did that," he said, and it wasn't a question. His gaze was on my split lip. I ran the back of my hand across my mouth and saw the blood that had already dried. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. "Do you have anywhere to go?" he asked. I almost laughed. Almost. Because the answer was so absurd that laughter seemed like the only possible reaction for a barefoot girl, bleeding in the middle of a dark street in Chicago, with everything she owned reduced to the clothes on her back. "No," I said. He nodded, as if my answer didn't surprise him, and slid the phone into his overcoat pocket with a slow, deliberate motion. That's when I realized he'd hung up the call at some point during the embrace. Not ended. Hung up, as if whoever was on the other end of the line had stopped mattering. A movement behind him made me stiffen, and my eyes darted to the shadow that materialized beside the black car, as if it had sprouted from the asphalt itself. Another man, younger than I expected, light hair cut short, eyes that seemed to register everything without settling on anything. He looked at me, then at the man in the overcoat, and his face didn't change, but something in his posture adjusted in an almost imperceptible way, as if he were filing away a piece of information that didn't fit the system he knew. He didn't say a word. "Get in the car," the man in the overcoat said to me, and it didn't sound like an order, even though I was certain he wasn't used to hearing no. "I don't know who you are," I replied, and the sarcasm came before I could hold it back, because sarcasm was what I used when the fear got too big to fit inside my body. "I just hugged a stranger in the middle of the street. I think getting in his car would be a bit too ambitious for one night." The corner of his mouth moved. It didn't quite become a smile. It was more the ghost of one, the shadow of something he probably didn't offer often. "Ronan," he said. "My name is Ronan." As if that settled everything. As if a first name, offered without a last name and without context, were credentials enough for me to get into a black car with tinted windows and two men I'd never seen in my life. But I was barefoot. I was bleeding. I was shaking with a cold that went beyond the temperature. And the man who hit me was somewhere out there in the darkness, probably deciding whether or not to come back. "Iris," I said, and I got in the car. The light-haired man sat in the front seat without looking back, and Ronan got in beside me, keeping a distance that seemed calculated to the millimeter, close enough for me to feel the heat radiating off him, far enough that no part of our bodies touched. As if the embrace from minutes ago had been an exception, he was already trying to file away as a mistake. I looked out the window as the car moved, and the streets of my neighborhood fell away behind us, as if they were part of a life being switched off, block by block. No one spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was heavy, loaded with the kind of things people who don't know each other don't yet know how to ask. The car stopped in front of a building in downtown Chicago that I only knew from passing it on the bus, never imagining what it looked like inside. Ronan got out first, waited for me to get out, and walked ahead of me as if clearing the way by instinct, not courtesy. The apartment was on the 7th floor, clean, neutral, functional, the kind of place that existed to not be remembered. A window looked out over a piece of the city that glowed below, as if nothing bad ever happened on its streets. "You're staying here tonight," Ronan said, standing in the doorway as if the idea of crossing that threshold alongside me were something he needed to deliberate. "Everything you need is here. We'll talk tomorrow." I wanted to ask about what. Wanted to ask who he was, why he'd been on that street, why he held me, why he brought me here, why my father backed off at the sight of him. But exhaustion was a wave already breaking, and I didn't have the strength to swim against it. "Thank you," I said. And it was insufficient. And I knew it was insufficient, but it was all I had. He nodded, left. The door closed behind him with a soft click. I went to the bathroom, washed my face, looked at the cut on my lip in the mirror, and went to the bedroom. Sleep came faster than I expected, as if my body had decided it was safe enough to shut down, at least for a few hours, in a place that belonged to a man whose last name I didn't even know. On the other side of the door, in the silent hallway of a floor that seemed to exist apart from the rest of the building, Ronan Morrigan stood with his hands in his pockets, staring at the closed door as if it contained something he didn't yet know how to classify. Cillian Hale, the light-haired man who hadn't said a single word since the street, approached. "You don't hold anyone," Cillian said, and his voice had that dry, flat quality that turned every sentence into a diagnosis. Ronan didn't look at him. "I know," he replied, and he walked down the hallway without looking back, leaving behind a silence that Cillian observed with the expression of someone who had just witnessed something that shouldn't exist, and that therefore deserved to be watched closely. Chapter 2. The Monster Who Cares. I woke up not knowing where I was. The mattress was too soft, the silence was too clean, and the smell wasn't the mold and cheap cigarettes I knew. Then I remembered, and remembering hurt. I sat up in bed, and my body protested. My feet burned, my face throbbed, and there was still dried blood under my nails from when I'd grabbed his shirt. The apartment was silent, an organized silence, without the layers of noise I knew. No television blaring at full volume, no heavy footsteps in the hallway, no clink of bottle against glass that meant Gregor had started drinking before noon. I got up, went to the bathroom, and looked in the mirror with the reluctant courage of someone who knows they won't like what they find. The cut on my lip had swollen and formed a dark scab. My left cheekbone was purple, the eye slightly swollen, enough to hide if no one looked closely, and enough to tell the whole truth if someone did. I washed my face carefully, using the warm water as if it were a luxury, and in that apartment, with that steady pressure and that precise temperature, maybe it was. Then I went back to the bedroom, sat on the edge of the bed, and stared at the door. I could leave. No one had locked me in. Ronan had said, "We'll talk tomorrow," and that was a sentence, not a sentence. I stood up, turned the handle. It gave without resistance. And then I saw Cillian. The light-haired man was leaning against the opposite wall with the ease of someone who lived in that position, arms crossed, his face wearing the same absolutely neutral expression from the night before. He looked at me as if I were an event scheduled on the day's agenda. No surprise, no hurry, nothing I could use to gauge what he was thinking. "Good morning," he said, and his voice had the same dryness as the night before, as if every word were weighed on a scale before being offered. "Ronan asked you to wait. He'll be here within the hour." "And if I don't want to wait?" I asked, leaning my shoulder against the doorframe with a casualness I didn't feel in the slightest. Cillian looked at me for 1 second longer than necessary, and the corner of his mouth made a movement so subtle it could have been a twitch, or it could have been the beginning of something that, in another person, would be a smile. "The door's open," he replied, "but I'd suggest shoes." I looked at my bare, cut-up feet, and realized he was right, and that sarcasm is a significantly less effective tool when you're literally in no condition to walk to the corner. I went back inside the apartment and closed the door behind me with the kind of dignity one can have when wearing pajamas borrowed from no one, bleeding from the lip, and without a cent to your name. The next hour was the longest of my life. I opened the fridge and found water, fruit, and organized containers of food that seemed to have been prepared by someone who knew what they were doing. I ate an entire apple standing in the kitchen, looking out the window at the city waking up below, and tried to put together a plan with the pieces I had, which were essentially none. When the apartment door opened, I was already sitting on the couch with my legs crossed, mentally rehearsing at least 3 different versions of, "Thank you for everything, but I'm leaving now." Ronan walked in, and the room shrank. In the daylight, his face was more defined than I remembered, and his eyes went straight to the bruise, then to the cut on my lip. His jaw clenched, a minimal movement I caught because I watched every man who entered a room I was in. Survival habit. Gregor taught me that without meaning to. Gregor disappeared, he said, without preamble and without sitting down. Same night. No one knows where. My father's name in his mouth sounded different, clinical, like a data point being presented in a meeting. I felt my stomach tighten, not with fear, but with something more complicated, a mix of relief and anxiety that refused to resolve into just one feeling. "And why do you know that?" I asked, because the question was right there, obvious, and I wasn't the type of person who pretends not to see the obvious just because it's more comfortable. Ronan looked at me with that calm I was beginning to recognize as his version of expression, not the absence of emotion, but the absolute control of it. "Because I know who he is," he replied, "and considering what he did to you, you need protection until the situation is resolved." "Protection," I repeated, and the word sounded strange in my mouth, like clothes that don't fit. "And what's the price?" "None. Nobody offers protection without a price," I said. "I grew up with a man who charged for every plate of food with a punch. Forgive me if I don't believe in spontaneous generosity. He didn't push, didn't argue, didn't take offense, didn't try to convince me with pretty phrases about good intentions. He just looked at me for 1 second longer than necessary and said, 'You don't have to believe. You just have to be safe.' And he turned away to answer the phone that had started buzzing in his pocket, leaving me alone with the sentence and no idea what to do with it. I called Soraya from the apartment's landline, a device I didn't even know still existed in the world, and asked her to bring clothes, because I had nothing but the pajamas I was wearing when I ran. I explained the bare minimum: fight with Gregor, escape, a man who helped me, a temporary apartment. Soraya listened to everything in silence, which was already a rare event, and then said, "Send me the address." When Soraya Nasri walked into the apartment 40 minutes later, carrying a suitcase that looked like it had been packed in a rush with whatever she found first in her own closet, she stopped in the middle of the living room, looked around with her mouth hanging open, and then looked at Cillian, who was standing by the door with the same expression as always. "Iris," she said, turning to me with wide eyes, "were you kidnapped or did you win the lottery? Because I need to know whether to call the police or ask to stay." Cillian, without moving a single muscle in his face, replied, "Both options are bad." "He speaks," she said, pointing at Cillian as if reporting a scientific phenomenon. "Iris, the statue speaks. I also hear," Cillian added, and left the room with the same discretion with which he'd entered, leaving Soraya with a half-smile she tried, unsuccessfully, to turn into indifference. Soraya hugged me as soon as we were alone, and it was the kind of hug she gave, tight, long, with one hand on the back of my neck and the other on my back, no questions and no rush to let go. When she pulled away, she looked at my face with an expression that hardened in a way I rarely saw in her. "Gregor?" she asked, and it wasn't really a question. I nodded. "I'm going to kill that man," she said, with the same ease she used to talk about swapping shifts at the restaurant. "I think someone's already taking care of that," I replied, and the weight of my own words caught me off guard, because I didn't know if I was making a joke or describing something I genuinely believed. Soraya stayed another hour, helped me change clothes, cleaned the cuts on my feet with the first aid kit she found under the bathroom sink, and only left when I promised I'd call if I needed anything, a promise we both knew I'd be reluctant to keep, because asking for help was the thing I did worst in the world. Late in the afternoon, Ronan came back. He entered the apartment with the same economy of movement as before, as if every step were planned to waste no energy. I was in the kitchen, drinking water, and he stopped on the other side of the counter as if the distance were a protocol he followed without thinking. "Thank you," I said, and the words came out before I had time to rehearse them. "For what you did last night. For the embrace. I know it seems like a small thing, but..." I stopped talking because his face did something I didn't expect. It was something raw, as if gratitude were a language he didn't speak, and he was decoding it in real time. He looked away for a fraction of a second, and his right hand moved at his side in a gesture that seemed involuntary, as if searching for his pocket, or the wall, or anything to anchor himself to. "You don't need to thank me," he said, and his voice came out lower than he probably intended. "I know I don't need to," I replied, "but I wanted to." The silence that hung between us wasn't empty. I held his gaze because it was the only thing I could offer in that moment, proof that I wasn't afraid of him, even when maybe I should have been. His phone rang, and the moment shattered like glass. Ronan answered without excusing himself, without asking permission, and I watched his face change as he listened to whatever was being said on the other end. The transformation was subtle and brutal at the same time. His eyes narrowed, his jaw locked, and something deep in that dark green hardened in a way that made me understand, for the first time, why Gregor had backed off at the sight of him on the street. When he hung up, he looked at me with an expression I didn't yet recognize. It wasn't the controlled calm. It wasn't the calculated coldness. It was something that seemed to precede a decision. The face of someone who just received information that changes the entire board. "What is it?" I asked, because his silence no longer felt like protocol. It felt like restraint. "Tomorrow," he said. "We'll talk tomorrow." And he left the apartment, leaving me alone with the certainty that he knew something about Gregor that I didn't. Something that had made that man, the one the whole world seemed to fear, look at me as if I were a piece in a game that had just gotten far more dangerous. Chapter 3. The Father's Name. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the dark trying to piece together what I knew, which was very little, and none of it fit. No phone, no money, no home, depending on a man who stirred an unease in me that I couldn't classify as fear or as something else. The next morning, Ronan didn't come alone. Beside him, entering the apartment with the restrained elegance of someone who measures each step as if it were a statement, was a man I'd never seen. Early 50s, dark gray suit, pale blue eyes with the temperature of an interrogation room. He carried a leather briefcase and assessed me with a quick, clinical look. "Iris," Ronan said, stopping in the center of the room with that posture that turned any space into his territory. "This is Declan Byrne. He's a lawyer and advisor to my family." Family. The word hung suspended in the air between us, and I turned it over in my head as I shook the hand Declan extended. Firm, dry, lasting exactly as long as someone who'd learned to calculate even gestures of courtesy. "Miss Istvan," Declan said, "Ronan informed me of your situation. I'm sorry about the circumstances." I nodded and looked at Ronan, who was standing near the window with Chicago's light at his back, waiting for the explanation he'd owed me since the night before. "Sit down," he said, and it wasn't exactly an order, but it wasn't an invitation either. I sat on the couch. Ronan stayed on his feet. Declan took the armchair across from me with the ease of someone used to delivering bad news in comfortable settings. "What I'm about to tell you," Ronan began, his eyes fixed on mine with an attention that made the air between us feel thicker, "isn't easy to hear, but you need to know. I survived 24 years with Gregor Istvan," I replied, crossing my arms over my chest in a gesture that was more shield than posture. "Go ahead." He nodded once, as if my answer had confirmed something he'd already expected. "Your father is a soldier for the Zakharov family," he said, "the Russian Bratva operating on Chicago's east side. Low-ranking muscle, but active. He's tied to operations involving territory control, collections, and intimidation." The words entered my body slowly, like ice water filling a space I didn't know was empty. I heard each one, understood their individual meaning, but the whole refused to settle into anything that made sense, because the image I had of Gregor, violent, yes, cowardly, yes, cruel in ways I carried on my body like scars, had never included the word mafia. In my mind, he was pathetic and dangerous at the same time, but the scale of his danger had always been limited to the perimeter of the walls where I grew up. And now Ronan was telling me that the perimeter was much larger than I'd imagined. "Bratva," I repeated, and the word had a strange taste in my mouth, as if it belonged to a language I understood but had never spoken. "My father works for the Russian mob." "Works," Ronan confirmed, and there was something in his tone that told me this wasn't the hard part of the conversation. "His disappearance wasn't a coincidence, Iris. He saw who I am that night, and decided it was safer to vanish than to stay." "And who are you?" I asked, because the question had been there since the very first moment, and I was tired of circling it as if it were a trap. Ronan looked at me for a full second without saying anything, and in that second I saw something I didn't expect to find in his eyes. Not hesitation, something that resembled care, as if he were choosing the angle from which the answer would reach me. "I'm the head of the Morrigan family," he said, "the organization that controls Chicago's west side, and the Zakharovs are our rivals." The room didn't change. The light kept coming through the window. The clock on the wall kept marking the seconds. Declan stayed seated with the leather briefcase in his lap, and the expression of someone watching a conversation, whose outcome he'd already predicted. But something inside me shifted, like a piece of furniture being dragged across a dark room. The sound was internal, muffled, and irreversible. I was the daughter of a Russian mafia soldier, and I was sitting in the apartment of the head of the Irish mob, protected by him, held by him, in fact, less than 48 hours ago, on a dark street where he had no obligation to stop. "So I'm the enemy's daughter," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I felt, because if there was one thing 24 years of Gregor had taught me, it was to hold my tone when the ground was giving way. Ronan didn't look away. "You're the daughter of a man who beat you until you bled, and then ran when he saw someone stronger on the street," he replied, and there was an edge of something in his voice that wasn't anger. It was contempt, cold and precise, aimed at Gregor with the efficiency of a blade. "What he does, or who he works for, doesn't change who you are." I wanted to say something sharp, something that proved I wasn't shaken, but I knew how to deal with punches and screaming. I didn't know how to deal with the discovery that the violence inside my home was the tip of something much larger. "I need a minute," I said. Ronan nodded. He and Declan left the apartment without another word, and the discretion of that exit, no comforting phrases, no questions, no awkwardness of someone who doesn't know what to say, was the first thing Ronan Morrigan did for me that I truly understood. He gave me space. Without asking me to be strong, without treating me as if I were fragile, he simply left and let me feel what I needed to feel. I cried for maybe 10 minutes, sitting on the couch, elbows on my knees, face in my hands, and the tears came with the force of someone who'd held on for too long. I didn't cry for Gregor. I'd stopped crying for him years ago. I cried because the story was worse than I knew, and because every time I thought I'd hit the bottom, someone showed me there was another floor below. Then I stopped, washed my face, and walked out of the apartment to find Cillian in the hallway. Same spot, same position, as if the world around him could collapse and he'd still be there, leaning against the wall, arms crossed, with the expression of someone who's already seen everything, at least twice. "Where is he?" I asked. "Upstairs," Cillian replied. "Want me to get him?" "No, I'll go to him." Cillian looked at me with an expression that lasted less than a second, but I caught it, something between surprise and approval, as if I'd done something most people in my position didn't do, go to Ronan instead of waiting for him to come. The floor above was different, larger, darker, with windows facing another angle of the city, and a long table where Declan was sitting, organizing documents. Ronan was near the window, phone in hand, and when he saw me walk in, something in his posture adjusted. It didn't relax, because I doubted that man relaxed under any circumstances, but it recalibrated, as if my presence required a different setting. "I have questions," I said, stopping at a distance that was close enough to talk and far enough for me to feel in control of something. "I know," he replied. "Is he coming back?" I asked. "Gregor, is he going to try to find me?" Ronan exchanged a quick look with Declan, the kind of look two people who've known each other for decades use to communicate an entire conversation in half a second, and then turned his eyes back to me. "Not while you're here," he said. "Is that a promise or a strategic assessment?" The corner of his mouth moved. "Both," he replied. I should have left right then. Should have thanked him for the protection, asked for cab money, and found somewhere else to stay. Soraya's place, a shelter, anywhere that wasn't the territory of the man who ran the rival mob to my father's. But I didn't leave, and it wasn't because I had no options. It was because, in that moment, with Chicago's light at his back, and those eyes that seemed to see things I hid from everyone, I didn't want to go. That was the part that scared me. The afternoon wore on, and I stayed. Ronan came and went from the upper floor with calls he took in a low voice, and conversations with Declan that I didn't try to overhear, not because I wasn't curious, but because I knew curiosity was a dangerous luxury in that environment. But between one call and the next, between one exit and one return, there were moments when the two of us were in the same space, and in those moments, the air changed. I noticed it first in the looks. He watched me when he thought I wasn't paying attention, quick glances that went from my face to my hands, and then to the cut on my lip, as if he were cataloging every injury and filing each one on a list he intended to collect from someone. And when I looked back, he didn't look away, but something deep in his eyes contracted, as if holding my gaze required an effort he wasn't used to making. Then I noticed it in the gestures, the step he took to the side when I passed too close, the door he opened before I reached it, and then let go too quickly, as if the gesture had slipped out without permission. Small retreats that said more than any sentence could. Close to midnight, I was in the kitchen on my floor, wide awake and not willing to pretend I could sleep, heating water for a tea I didn't want, but that gave me something to do with my hands. The apartment was silent. That clean, vast silence I still hadn't learned to inhabit without feeling uneasy. Then I heard the footsteps. Ronan appeared in the kitchen doorway as if conjured by the silence. No warning, no sound, just materializing there with the ease of someone who belonged wherever he decided to be. Without the overcoat, and without the sweater, he seemed both less imposing and more real. The tattoo on his neck continued down his left arm in an intricate shamrock, dark against pale skin. We were less than a step apart. The kitchen wasn't small, but in that moment, it seemed to have shrunk around us, as if the walls had decided to push the air out and leave only the warmth and the narrow space between his body and mine. He looked at my face, at the cut on my lip, which was already healing, but still marked the skin like a dark line that insisted on telling a story I wanted to forget. Then he looked into my eyes, and the intensity of that gaze made me hold my breath, not from fear, but from something that came from a place deeper than fear, a place where the body responds before the mind and reason arrives too late to explain what's already happening. He raised his hand. I watched his hand rise slowly, with a deliberateness that wasn't hesitation. It was control, the kind of control of a man who calculates every gesture because he learned that unthinking gestures have consequences, and moved toward my face. His fingers stopped less than a centimeter from my cheek, so close I could feel the heat of his skin without the touch, like a promise that refused to be kept. And then he lowered his hand. "No one is ever going to hurt you again," he said, and his voice came out so low I had to stop breathing to hear it, as if the words were made for the tiny space between us, and no one else. "You make dangerous promises to someone you just met," I replied, and the nervous half-smile that came with the words was my way of dealing with the fact that my heart was beating too fast, and my hands were tingling with the urge to do what he hadn't done, close that centimeter of distance that separated his hand from my face. He didn't smile, but his eyes changed. Something in the dark green softened, like a door that opens just a centimeter, enough to let in a sliver of light, but not enough to see what's on the other side. And I realized, with the clarity that only comes when you're too close to someone to pretend you don't see, he had already fallen, before me, before I understood what was happening between us. Before I'd had time to decide whether I wanted it or not, he was already there, in the place you don't come back from, looking at me with the eyes of someone who knows he's lost, and has no intention of asking for directions. He took a step back. The air returned, and I released the breath I hadn't even realized I'd been holding. "Good night, Iris," he said, and left the kitchen with the same silence he'd entered with, leaving me alone with a cup of tea that had already gone cold, and the absolute certainty that this man, whom the entire world feared, and who hadn't touched anyone in years, had almost touched me, and that I wanted him to. The next morning, Ronan told me something that changed the tone of everything. He was upstairs with Declan when I came up for coffee, because at some point between the first and second day, I'd stopped waiting for an invitation to move through the space, and had simply started occupying it. "My father was murdered 4 years ago," he said, without prior context and without preparation, as if the information carried too much weight to bear preambles, in an ambush set up by the Zakharovs. I was with him. I stopped with the mug halfway between the table and my mouth, and looked at him. His expression was the same as always, controlled, impenetrable, his eyes fixed on a point by the window as if he were talking about the weather, and not about his own father's death. But his hands, resting on the table, were tense, his knuckles slightly white, a hairline crack in the composure that I only noticed because I was looking for it. "I was holding his hand," Ronan continued, and his voice didn't shake, but it dropped half a note, as if the words were being pulled from a place he kept locked and only opened when he had no choice. I felt the exact moment the grip went slack. I didn't say anything, because anything I said would have been too small for the size of it, and I knew, from my own experience, from years of words that didn't help and phrases that didn't heal, that sometimes the most respectful thing you can offer someone who's bleeding inside is the silence of someone who understands the wound exists and doesn't try to close it with words. "Since then," he said, and finally looked at me, "I don't touch anyone." The sentence fell between us like a stone into a lake, and the ripples spread in every direction. I understood it all at once. The embrace on the street, the hesitation, the hand that pulled back, the distance from everything and everyone. It wasn't coldness. It was grief, so deep it had become armor, and the armor had become the person he showed the world. And I, a stranger bleeding on a dark street, had made him break that rule without warning and without permission. "But you held me," I said, and it wasn't an accusation or a question. It was the acknowledgement of something we both knew, and neither of us had said out loud until now. "I know," he replied, and in his voice there was something that sounded like his version of astonishment, contained, controlled, but real, as if he still hadn't found an explanation for what his own body had decided that night. Declan cleared his throat at the other end of the table with the discretion of a man who'd witnessed too many things in his life to be surprised, but not enough to stop signaling when a conversation was entering territory outside his jurisdiction. Ronan composed himself, not abruptly, but with the fluidity of someone putting the armor back on with the practice of doing it every day, and changed the subject with the same efficiency he used to switch languages in a negotiation. Late in the afternoon, Soraya came to visit again. I heard her arrive before I saw her, because Soraya had the kind of presence that announces itself through noise, heels on the floor, bag hitting her thigh, voice already starting a sentence in the hallway before entering the room. She stopped in front of Cillian, at his usual post in the corridor. "Do you live in this hallway, or are you a wax statue?" she asked. "Statues don't roll their eyes," he replied. "Good," Soraya said, smiling. "At least now I know you're human." She walked into the apartment still laughing, and I laughed with her. For the first time in days, the kind of laugh that comes from relief, and not from joy, but that heals just the same. We laughed at the absurdity of the situation, the the guarded hallway, my life that had turned into a story neither of us recognized, and for a few minutes, the weight of everything I'd learned that day grew lighter. In the hallway, footsteps approached. Ronan was passing on his way upstairs and paused for a second, not long enough to look inside the apartment, but long enough to hear my laughter echoing through the silent corridor. He didn't say anything. He didn't come in. He kept walking. But Cillian, who missed nothing, watched Ronan slow his step at the sound, and he filed the information away with the quiet precision of someone who knew that at some point it would matter. That same night, while I was already lying down trying to convince my brain to shut off, Ronan received a piece of information that changed the temperature of everything. I didn't find out then. I found out later, from the edges, from the way the air on the upper floor grew thicker the next morning, and from the calls Declan took behind closed doors. Gregor Istvan wasn't just a Zakharov soldier. He was selling information from his own organization to third parties. He was betraying the Bratva that employed him, trading Zakharov secrets behind his own boss's back. My father wasn't just violent and cowardly. He was a traitor inside an organization that punished betrayal with death, and that, as I would soon discover, changed absolutely everything. Chapter 4. The Chess Game. Something changed in Ronan after the information about Gregor. In his eyes, there was the focus of someone who sees 10 moves ahead and is deciding which one to use. I wasn't invited to the meetings, but on the morning of the third day, I went upstairs without warning and stopped at the door. The three of them were together for the first time. Ronan at the head, Declan to the right with an open folder, Cillian to the left with his arms crossed. The image had the weight of something that had been working for years without needing explanation. When he saw me at the door, his gaze rose slowly, and I felt his attention settle on me with that weight that was already familiar, the kind of presence that didn't need words to be felt. "I want to know what's going on," I said, and my voice came out steady because I'd rehearsed the sentence in the hallway and decided I wasn't going to phrase it as a request. "Iris," Declan began, with the measured tone of someone who weighed objections like dosages. "There are details that, at this point, it would be more prudent to—" "She stays," Ronan cut in, without taking his eyes off me. Declan looked at Ronan with an expression that, in any other man, would have been surprise, but in him manifested only as a pause, the recalibration of someone who disagreed, but understood the hierarchy. Cillian didn't move a muscle. I sat in the empty chair at the opposite end of the table and folded my hands in my lap, and Ronan began to speak with the precision of someone who'd already assembled the entire argument and was simply presenting the conclusions. "Your father isn't just a Zakharov soldier," he said. "Gregor sells Bratva information to third parties. Transport routes, contact names, operational details. He's betraying the organization that employs him, and he's been doing it for at least 2 years." The information clicked into place in my brain with a muffled snap. The burner phones, the money with no pattern, the nervousness I'd mistaken for drinking. It all made sense now, and the sense was worse than I'd imagined. "And what are you going to do with that?" I asked, because I already knew Ronan well enough to know he wouldn't have told me if he didn't have a plan. He looked at me for a second before answering, and in that second I saw the strategist, not the man who held me on the street, not the man who almost touched my face in the kitchen, but the leader who ran an entire organization, and who looked at every piece of information as a tool. "I'm going to hand him over," he said. "Not to the police, to Zakharov." The name landed on the table like a weight. Viktor Zakharov, the head of the Russian Bratva, Ronan's rival, the man whose name I heard in that apartment as often as the sound of phone calls and the rustle of Declan's documents. If Zakharov finds out that Gregor betrayed his own organization, Ronan continued, his voice carrying the cadence of someone explaining a move he'd already calculated to the last outcome. "He takes care of the problem himself. Gregor loses the Bratva's protection, loses his position, loses everything. And it's not an attack. It's an offering. I'm delivering a truth Zakharov needs to hear." "And in return?" I asked. "In return, an alliance," Declan replied, taking over the part of the conversation that was his with the fluidity of a man who'd been negotiating for decades. "Not friendship, not trust, but a ceasefire that benefits both sides and costs Ronan only a piece of information he already has." I looked at Ronan. He looked back, and between his gaze and mine, without a single word being spoken, something passed that I felt at the base of my spine, the understanding that he wasn't doing this for the territory, or for the power, or for the strategic advantage Declan described with the coldness of a report. He was doing it for me, and that understanding came with another, more dangerous one. He knew that I knew. "I'm not a piece on your board," I said, because I needed to say it, Because if I didn't say it right then, the line between protection and control would blur in a way I wouldn't know how to undo later. Ronan held my gaze with an intensity that made the air between us go electric, thick, charged, like the atmosphere before a storm that's already made up its mind but hasn't fallen yet. "If you were," he replied, in a voice that dropped half a note and took on a texture I'd never heard from him, "I wouldn't be losing the game." The room went silent. Declan looked at his papers with the sudden dedication of someone who'd found something fascinating in a contractual clause. Cillian stayed still, but the corner of his mouth twitched in a spasm so brief it could have been imagination. And I sat there, in the chair, with my heart beating too loud, and the certainty that Ronan Morrigan had just admitted, in front of his advisor and his right hand, without caring about either of them, that I had power over him, that he was losing something, and that something was control. The days that followed were marked by a dual tension that fed on itself. On one side, Ronan and Declan assembled the dossier on Gregor with a meticulousness that turned every document, every record, every piece of evidence of betrayal into a brick in a wall that would surround my father on all sides. On the other side, the space between Ronan and me kept shrinking, not physically, because he continued to maintain the same calculated distance as always, but emotionally, as if every conversation, every look, every shared silence eroded another centimeter of the barrier he'd built around himself. And then the message arrived. I was in the apartment with Soraya, who'd come to bring more clothes and news from the restaurant where I worked. The manager wanted to know if I was coming back. The regulars were asking about me. Everyday life kept spinning on the outside as if my existence hadn't been turned inside out. Someone knocked on the door, and Cillian opened it to a man I'd never seen. Short, nervous, with eyes that moved too fast. He handed over an envelope and disappeared before Cillian could do more than look at him with the expression of someone filing a face away for future use. Inside the envelope, an unsigned note, in handwriting I recognized as if it were a scar, Gregor's crooked, hurried scrawl. The words were few and direct, that I was being deceived, that Ronan Morrigan was dangerous, that I was being used as a bargaining chip in a war I didn't understand, and that if I had a shred of sense, I'd run while I still could. I read the note twice. The first time, my stomach went cold with the reflexive fear that Gregor's voice still triggered, even on paper. The second time, I saw what was really there, a coward sending messages from a distance, not to save me, but to drag me back to the only place where he had power. Soraya read over my shoulder and let out a word in Arabic that I didn't know, but whose meaning was perfectly clear from the tone. "You're not going to listen to this," she said, and it wasn't a question. "No," I replied, "but not because I trust Ronan, because I don't trust Gregor." The distinction mattered, and I needed it said out loud to myself before anything else happened. Ronan found out about the message less than an hour later, not because I told him, but because Cillian had an information network that ran with the silent efficiency of a machine and the discretion of a shadow. He walked into the apartment with a calm I already knew to recognize as the opposite of what it seemed. The quieter he got, the more dangerous the subject was. "I saw the note," I said before he could speak, because I refused to wait for him to steer that conversation. "Gregor sent a message, said you're dangerous and that I'm being used." Ronan stopped in the middle of the room. He didn't sit, didn't cross his arms, didn't assume any posture of defense or attack. He just stood there, hands at his sides, eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that seemed to demand the rest of the world disappear, so that moment could have enough room. "Do you believe him or me?" he asked, and his voice was low, controlled, with a calm that chilled, not the calm of someone who doesn't care, but of someone who cares too much to let emotion contaminate the question. I looked at him, looked into those dark green eyes that had watched me for the past several days with an attention I'd never received from anyone. Not surveillance, not desire, not calculation, but something that resembled care. The kind of care that comes from someone who doesn't know how to show affection, and so offers the only thing he does know, protection. "I don't believe anyone," I replied, "but I'm here." The sentence hung between us like an unfinished bridge. It didn't reach the other side, but it pointed the way. Ronan nodded once, slowly, and something deep in his eyes shifted. Not relief, because relief would have been too simple for him, but something that resembled a decision being made. As if my answer, which was neither trust nor surrender, was exactly what he needed to hear to know the next step was the right one. He left the apartment without saying anything more, and I knew, from the weight of that silence, that he'd just decided he was going to end this, not for revenge, not for territory, for me. The meeting with Zakharov happened 3 days later. The restaurant was on a street with no commercial signage in downtown Chicago. No sign, no line, nothing to tell the world that inside, decisions were being made about things the world preferred not to know. Ronan went in first. Cillian stayed outside with 2 men who didn't need instructions. Viktor Zakharov was already seated. Early 50s, broad shoulders that the gray suit didn't try to disguise, hair buzzed short, and eyes so pale blue they looked faded, as if they'd already seen enough to lose their color. He didn't stand when Ronan sat across from him, didn't extend his hand. He simply watched him with the patience of a man who knew time was a weapon, and that he had more of it than anyone in the room. "Morrigan," he said, and the Russian accent made the name a heavier thing. "Zakharov," Ronan replied, and placed the leather folder on the white tablecloth between them, with the same calm with which one offers a menu. Zakharov didn't ask what it was. He opened it, read. The reading lasted a full 4 minutes, and during those 4 minutes his face didn't change. Not a muscle, not a reaction, nothing, but his hands changed. The fingers holding the pages gripped the paper tighter on the second document, and by the third, there was a crease where his thumb had pressed. When he finished, he closed the folder, looked at Ronan, and the silence between the two men had the weight of a contract being drafted in real time. "The problem is mine," Zakharov said. "The debt is acknowledged." Ronan nodded once, stood, and left the restaurant without turning his back, not out of courtesy, but because men like him didn't turn their backs on men like Zakharov, and they both knew it, and neither of them pretended otherwise. I found out through Declan, who mentioned just enough for me to put the picture together. Gregor would be expelled from the Bratva, would lose his protection, would lose everything. In return, a fragile alliance was born between the two families. Not friendship, not trust, but business. The kind of peace that holds because both sides gain more from keeping it than breaking it. When I found out, I was quiet for a long time, sitting on the bed in the apartment, hands still in my lap, my mind trying to process the scale of what had happened. Ronan had destroyed the life of the man who'd been hurting me since I was a child, without blood, without a single bullet, only with intelligence and the cold precision of someone who dismantles a bomb wire by wire, and I didn't know if that relieved me or terrified me, because the same precision he used to bring down Gregor was the precision he used in everything, and if that precision ever turned on me, I'd have no way to protect myself. I went to find him. He was upstairs, alone for the first time since I'd met him. No Declan, no Cillian, no phone in his hand. He was near the window, looking out at the city with his hands in his pockets, and when I walked in, he turned with a slowness that said he'd already known I was there before I appeared. "Why did you do it?" I asked, and my voice didn't come out accusatory or grateful. It came out honest, a question with no disguise, without the armor of sarcasm I used for everything, without a safety net. Ronan looked at me. His eyes traveled across my face with that attention that made me feel exposed and seen at the same time, a combination that should have been uncomfortable, but that with him had the opposite effect, as if being seen by someone who truly looks was a kind of intimacy I didn't know existed. "Because no one ever did for you," he replied. The sentence entered me with the force of something I didn't know I needed to hear. It wasn't a declaration of love. It was rawer and more honest than that. It was the recognition that I'd spent 24 years taking care of myself, surviving alone, getting beaten alone, running alone, and that no one, not a single person in my entire life, had looked at my pain and decided to do something about it. Until him. I didn't cry. I didn't hug him. I didn't say thank you, because thank you would have been too small, and I'd already learned that the most important things between us happened in the space between words, not in the words themselves. I just looked at him, and let my eyes say what my mouth couldn't put together, that something had changed, that the bridge between us had advanced another step, and that I wasn't there anymore just because I had nowhere else to go. I was there because I wanted to be. Ronan saw it. I know he did, because his face did that subtle thing I already knew, the minimal contraction at the corners of his eyes, the nearly imperceptible softening of the jaw, the crack in the composure that lasted less than a second, but said more than any sentence he could construct. And then, for the first time since we met, Ronan Morrigan, the man who didn't touch anyone, the man who held his father's hand as he died, and never wanted to hold anything again, extended his hand to me, open, palm up, waiting. It wasn't a command. It was a request, the first I'd seen him make since I'd known him, asking in silence for something he didn't know how to name. I looked at his hand, looked at the long fingers, the veins on the back. The skin I already knew was warm because my body remembered the embrace on the street as if the memory were etched not in the mind, but in the muscles, the bones, the skin that had touched his for 1 second and never forgotten. Chapter 5. 1 second. Again. I placed my hand in his fingers closed around mine with a slowness that seemed to hold entire years of restraint, as if every centimeter of contact were a line he was crossing for the first time, and he needed to feel the weight of each one before moving on to the next. His palm was warm and rough, larger than mine in a way that made my hand disappear inside his, and when the grip firmed, I felt something release inside my chest, a knot I didn't even know existed, and that came undone with the quiet simplicity of things that take too long to happen and no time at all to change everything. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, with my hand in his, and his eyes in mine, and his face wore an expression I'd never seen on him. Not the controlled calm, not the strategic coldness, not the intensity he used as a weapon. It was something more disarmed than all of that. Something that resembled his version of wonder at the fact that his own body had done this, and it hadn't hurt, and the world hadn't ended. "Come with me," he said. I went. He took me to the Morrigan penthouse, the top floor of the building, a place I hadn't been to yet, and whose existence I only knew from Declan's veiled references, and Ronan's footsteps that sometimes went up beyond the floor I lived on. The private elevator opened onto a space that knocked the air out of my lungs before I could fake indifference. All of Chicago stretched out beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. The apartment was wide and dark, in shades of gray and wood, a space that had his personality imprinted on every surface without needing a single decoration. Ronan let go of my hand as he walked in, and the absence of the touch was immediate and cold, like a door closing in a heated room. He went to a side table, poured 2 glasses of something amber I assumed was whiskey, and offered me one without asking if I drank. I took it. The liquid went down warm and bitter, and the burn in my chest served as an anchor for what I was feeling. Nerves, attraction, fear, and an absurd desire to be close to him that was stronger than any logic I could use to protect myself. We sat near the window, not on the couch, on the floor, with our backs against the cold glass and the city glowing behind us as if it were an audience watching something only the 2 of us knew was happening. The position wasn't planned. I sat first, because my legs had that kind of weakness that doesn't come from exhaustion, but from emotion, and he sat beside me with the ease of someone who, once the decision to be close was made, saw no reason to negotiate distances. "I never belonged anywhere," I said, and the words came out before I decided to say them, as if the whiskey and the closeness and the city lights had lowered the guard I'd kept up for as long as I could remember. I spent my whole life trying to survive inside that house, and when I wasn't inside it, I was trying to be invisible outside it. I never had a place that was mine. I never had a person that was mine. Ronan listened in silence, his glass resting on his knee, eyes fixed on the city below, but his attention was on me. I felt it with the same certainty I felt the cold glass against my back, and the warmth radiating from his body beside me. "The restaurant was the closest I ever came to a home," I went on, and I laughed softly at my own sentence, because the idea of a neighborhood restaurant with sticky tables and lousy tips being my safe place was funny and sad at the same time. Soraya was my family. The night shift was my routine, and I told myself it was enough because if I admitted it wasn't, I'd have to look at everything that was missing, and I didn't have the strength for that. Ronan turned the glass between his fingers, a slow, almost hypnotic gesture, and when he spoke, his voice had the texture of something being said out loud for the first time. "My father's name was Eamon," he said. "He was everything I knew about what a man should be. When the Zakharovs set the ambush, 2 cars blocked the street. 6 armed men. My father took 3 bullets before I could drag him behind the car." He stopped, took a sip of the whiskey. I held his hand on the asphalt, talked to him the whole time, even knowing it wouldn't help, and at some point, the grip went slack. I didn't say anything. I stayed there, beside him, and let the silence do what words couldn't. "After that night," he said, "I didn't touch anyone again. My body decided on its own that touch was synonymous with loss, and I let it. But you touched me," I said, and the sentence came loaded with everything I felt and didn't know how to say, not as a demand, not as a question, but as the acknowledgement of something we both knew had been impossible and had happened anyway. "You asked," he replied, and looked at me with those eyes that seemed to hold things he didn't show anyone else. "And if I ask again?" I said, and my voice came out lower than I'd planned, almost a whisper that the space between us made more intimate than any touch. Ronan looked at me for a second, that lasted long enough for me to feel every beat of my heart in my throat, my temples, my fingertips. And then he raised his hand, and this time he didn't pull back. His fingers landed on my face with a lightness that made me close my eyes. He touched the exact spot where the cut had been, the lower lip, the corner of the mouth, the skin that had healed but still held the memory of the wound. His thumb traced the line where the blood had run that first night, as if erasing the trail, replacing the pain with something else, something that made every inch of my skin come alive and the air vanish from my lungs. I opened my eyes and found his centimeters from mine, green, dark, with an intensity that was no longer control. It was surrender. He pressed his forehead against mine, and his breath hit warm against my lips. And at that minimal point of contact, forehead to forehead, his nose brushing mine, his hand open on my face, as if holding something that might break, I felt more intimacy than in any kiss I'd ever received in my life. "Iris," he said, and my name in his mouth sounded as if it were the first time he'd used his voice for something other than commanding, threatening, or negotiating. I closed the distance. The kiss began like everything between us, slowly, with the hesitation of two people who knew the weight of what they were doing. His lips were firm and warm against mine, and when I parted my mouth, he answered with a contained urgency that made me understand this man had been holding himself back for days, maybe since the first night, and the rope keeping everything in place had just snapped. He pulled me closer with the hand on my face, and his other hand found my waist with a firmness that took my breath away, not from force, but from certainty. He held me as if he knew exactly where he wanted me, and as if every point of contact between his body and mine were a piece of data he was cataloging with the same precision he brought to everything in his life. I felt the muscles of his chest against mine when he pulled me in, felt the heat of his body crossing through the fabric like a fever, and my hands climbed his dark sweater to his broad shoulders, feeling the tension in every muscle contracting beneath my palms. The fear I expected to feel didn't come. In its place was something warm and immense that made me want more. More pressure, more heat, more of him. Ronan stood without letting go of me, and the movement had the fluidity of someone whose body was a machine trained to act without waste. He lifted me with him, hands on my waist, with an ease that reminded me of his size compared to mine, and carried me to the bedroom with steps I felt more than saw, because his mouth never left mine, and my eyes were closed and the entire world had shrunk to the sound of our breathing and the friction of our bodies moving together. The backs of my legs met the edge of the bed, and he laid me down with a hand on my back that controlled the descent with a precision that made me understand something about him. Even there, even with his breathing out of control and his eyes darkened with desire, he was aware of every inch of my body. Not out of control, out of care. The kind of care a man who taught himself not to touch anyone devotes when he finally does. Absolute, focused, almost reverent. He positioned himself above me, and his weight pressed me into the mattress in a way that made me gasp, not from pain, but from the sensation of being enveloped by something larger and more solid than me, something that made me feel vulnerable and protected at the same time. His arms supported part of his weight on either side of my head, and I saw the muscles of his forearms contract with the effort, the veins rising beneath the skin, the black shamrock tattoo stretching with the movement. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, and his voice came out hoarse, with a texture that made me tighten my fingers on his shoulders. "I'm never going to hurt you." "I know," I replied, and it was true. And the truth of that sentence was the most terrifying and liberating thing I'd ever said. He took off my shirt with both hands, and his fingers traced down the side of my body with a deliberate slowness that made every inch of my skin light up as if being touched for the first time. And in a way it was, because no touch I'd ever received in my life felt like this. His mouth moved down my neck, and I felt his lips warm and firm against the curve between my shoulder and my ear, his breath heavy against my skin, and the low sound he made when I arched my body against his erased whatever thread of rational thought I had left. Clothes came off like barriers that no longer made sense. His, mine, each layer removed with an urgency that grew with every second, and that turned the calculated gestures of the beginning into something more instinctive, more raw, more honest. When there was nothing left between us, I looked at him, really looked, with the freedom of someone who decided she wasn't going to look away, and what I saw took the air out of me. A thin scar cut across the left side of his chest, and the eyes looking back at me held an intensity that wasn't just desire, it was reverence. He entered me slowly, with a measured depth that made me grab the sheets with both hands, and hold my breath as if my lungs couldn't hold the air alongside everything else. The sensation was fullness, not just physical, but the fullness of a space that had been empty for too long, and was being filled by someone who knew exactly how to occupy it. "Look at me," he said, and his voice was a low growl that vibrated against my skin as he tilted his face close to mine. I looked, and what I found in his eyes undid me more than any movement of his body. He was at the edge of something that had no name, with his defenses on the ground, and vulnerability exposed in the depths of those dark green eyes, and I understood that this moment was as new for him as it was for me, that he was touching himself as much as he was touching me, that the hand that held mine in the living room had been his first voluntary touch in 4 years, and that everything after it was uncharted territory for a man who'd turned solitude into a system. The pace quickened. His movements grew shorter and deeper, each one hitting a spot that made my body clench and my thoughts fracture into smaller and smaller pieces. I felt the sweat on his skin under my hands, the heat of his chest against mine, the sound of our bodies meeting in a rhythm that built like a wave, with no intention of pulling back. My legs closed around his waist, pulling him closer, deeper, and he answered with a low sound against my neck that was half control and half surrender. "Iris," he said again, and this time my name wasn't a sentence. It was a confession. I broke first. The tension that had been climbing since the first touch reached a point that wouldn't accept restraint any longer, and my body clenched around him with an intensity that made me dig my nails into his shoulders and let out a sound I didn't know existed inside me. He followed seconds later, his face buried in my neck and his body rigid in one last deep thrust, and the sound he made, low, contained, broken, was the sound of a man allowing himself to feel something for the first time in years, and the feeling was too big to fit inside the control he maintained over everything else. We stayed like that for a time I didn't measure, him inside me, heavy and warm, his breathing slowing against my skin, his fingers loose in my hair, a gesture so small and so impossible coming from him that it made my eyes sting with an emotion I refused to call tears. When he lay beside me, we were quiet. The city glowed on the other side of the window as if nothing had changed, and I rested my head on his chest and listened to the heart that was still beating fast against my ear, gradually slowing until it found a rhythm that was steady and constant, and that sounded in that moment like the safest thing in the world. His fingers in my hair continued, a slow movement he probably didn't even notice, his body taking care of me without knowing it was taking care. "I chose to stay," I said softly, against his chest. "Not because I have nowhere to go, because I want to be here." His hand paused in my hair for an instant, a pause so brief I almost didn't feel it, and then resumed, with the same slowness as before. He didn't answer with words, but the arm around my shoulders tightened, and that small squeeze said everything that needed to be said. I closed my eyes and let sleep approach with the confidence of someone who, for the first time in 24 years, didn't need to sleep with one eye open. His body was solid and warm around me. The heartbeat was a song I didn't know I needed to hear, and the city below kept spinning without knowing that up there, two broken people had just discovered that their pieces fit together. I had chosen to stay. He had chosen to let me in. And that night, at the top of Chicago, that was enough. Lena here. That wraps up book 1, and I've already finished book 2. You can get access to it for a really small fee. I thought I'd already survived the worst. I was wrong. Everything changed the day I found a photo hidden among the things from my past, and with it, the devastating feeling that my entire life had been built on a lie. Suddenly, the questions grew too big, the answers too dangerous, and the name I'd carried for years no longer seemed enough to explain who I was. But in Ronan Morrigan's world, buried truths never come alone, and when I started looking, I realized too late that uncovering the past could cost far more than I was ready to lose. Like I said, that was just a taste of book 2. To watch it uncensored, just click on the first link here in the pinned comment. I'll see you on the other side in a few seconds. Remember, just click on the first link down here in the comments, and book 2 complete, no ads, no interruptions, will already be available for you. It's very simple. Book 2 is something I'm loving making. You're loving it too, so I promise there will be more. It's where you find increasingly spicy stories, a true dark romance. And precisely because this version is getting more and more heated, the video isn't well accepted publicly on YouTube. This closed environment is where I can actually share my essence and where I feel free to do my best work for you. More news coming soon. I'll be waiting for you on the other side. Unfortunately, many people have been downloading our audio, effectively copying the entire story, and simply reposting it on YouTube. If you want to watch the original story and be the first to receive the next ones, search for My Stories by Lena on YouTube to get the best dark romance content. Remember, the official channel is My Stories by Lena on YouTube. I'll be waiting for you there.